People who work in morgues or with the dead, what is the creepiest thing you've witnessed? Back in college, I worked for a pathologist, and I can safely say I've seen just about everything you can imagine that goes on behind the scenes in a hospital. Part of my job was helping prepare biological samples for shipment, everything from organs to unusual growths that needed further study. It sounds wild, but after a while, it all just became part of the routine. Things didn't always run smoothly, though. Labs are busy, and sometimes samples or containers would get misplaced for a few days until someone eventually tracked them down. When that happened, you learned quickly why good organization mattered. Yeah, I also helped out during a lot of autopsies. Most of the time, I could keep things professional and detached, but cases involving infants or very young patients always stayed with me. Those moments made me appreciate just how fragile life really is. Over time, I worked in nearly every part of the hospital: the operating room, emergency department, intensive care, post-op recovery, even the neonatal unit. Every area had its own kind of chaos, its own stories. Hospitals might seem calm on the outside, but behind the doors, they're constantly buzzing with motion and emotion. And yes, for all the seriousness of the work, hospital life had its lighter side too. Between long shifts, tight quarters, and lots of young staff members, there was definitely some real-life drama going on. Maybe not quite Grey's Anatomy levels, but Scrubs? Yeah, that felt a lot closer to reality. Next story. I used to work as an embalmer at a funeral home. Nothing too strange ever happened to me there. Until one day, something I still can't explain. A friend of mine believed in mediums, people who claim they can speak with spirits. I didn't, but I decided to tag along when he went for a session. The medium didn't know I was coming, and as soon as we sat down, she kept glancing at me with a puzzled expression. Finally, she said, "I'm sorry. This is unusual. You're surrounded by so many spirits. Have you lost a lot of people in your life?" I told her no, only a few distant relatives. She frowned and said softly, "That's strange. There are too many here." The session went on, mostly focused on my friend, until she suddenly turned toward me again and said, "Do you know someone named Achwatulskik?" I told her I didn't. She paused, then said, "She says she liked that you were kind to her. She says thank you for sitting with her in the cold and combing her hair." I laughed it off. I had no idea what she was talking about. But hours later, driving home, it hit me. The name belonged to a young woman I had worked on at the funeral home months earlier. Her case had stood out to me, and at the end of my shift, I'd taken a moment to gently smooth her hair before leaving. I had never told anyone about that. To this day, I'm still not sure what to make of it. I've never had any ghostly experiences in the mortuary before or since, but that moment made me question everything I thought I knew. Next story. A friend told me this story years ago, and I still think about it every time I get on a plane. When he was 18, he worked for a small transport company that used single-engine planes. One day, they were asked to deliver a body to another city for preparation. It hadn't been embalmed or processed yet, just carefully wrapped and placed on the floor of the plane. Now, anyone who's flown in a small aircraft knows how air pressure changes constantly as you go up and down. During the flight, the shifting pressure caused something unexpected. The air inside the body slowly escaped through the throat, creating a long, low sound. At the same time, the turbulence made the body shift and sit up slightly as the wrapping slipped away. So imagine this. They're flying, everything's quiet, and suddenly there's this eerie moan, followed by the sight of the body slowly rising in the back of the plane. The pilot completely panicked. He jumped out of his seat, ran to the back, and, acting on pure instinct, gave the body a shove to knock it back down. When they finally landed and explained what had happened, everyone realized it was just science, changes in air pressure and motion making the body move. But my friend said he had never seen a pilot turn that pale before in his life. To this day, it's one of the strangest and funniest stories I've ever heard. Next story. I work in hospice care, so sadly, I often see people during their final days. You learn to stay calm and respectful in those moments, but sometimes something happens that you just can't explain. One night, one of my patients had just passed away. It was peaceful and quiet in the room. And then, almost immediately, the phone rang. I picked it up and it was the woman's daughter calling from hundreds of miles away. She hadn't called or visited the entire time her mother had been in my care, but now, right after her mother's passing, she sounded panicked and asked, "Is my mom okay?" The timing gave me chills. It really felt like she somehow knew something had happened, even though she was so far away. What made it even more touching was that during her last few days, the mother kept talking about needing to find her daughter. That moment has stayed with me ever since. Next story. I spent 3 years working in an emergency room in New York City. One 4th of July, things were unusually calm. Holidays can sometimes go that way. In our ER, we had a special red phone that EMS used to call ahead about incoming patients. Usually it meant we'd get a few minutes notice before someone arrived. Maybe a heart attack, a stroke, or a critical case. That day, the red phone rang, and the dispatcher told me a shooting victim was on the way. That almost never happened at our hospital since we weren't a major trauma center. If a case like that came to us, it usually meant the person was so close and in such serious condition that they couldn't make it to the bigger hospital. A few minutes later, EMS rolled in with the patient. The team did everything possible, but the injuries were too severe. Despite all efforts, we couldn't save him. He had no ID, so we didn't even know who he was. Then, something I'd never experienced before began. The ER turned into an active crime scene. Detectives came in, taking photos and notes right there in the trauma bay. It was surreal to watch that unfold where, just moments earlier, we were fighting to save someone's life. Afterward, I took my usual post-shift breather, grabbing a quick meal and trying to reset. When I came back, the investigators were done and the patient had been taken to the morgue. A little while later, we got word that the police had identified him, which brought a bit of relief to everyone. But then things got strange again. The detectives came back saying they couldn't find the body. It had disappeared. For about 3 hours, everyone was in disbelief. People were making calls, searching every possible area, thinking the unthinkable had happened. Finally, we learned the truth. There was a completely separate morgue area used specifically for unidentified patients. The detectives had been searching in the wrong one the whole time. For those few surreal hours, though, it really felt like something out of a mystery story. A moment of pure chaos inside a place where we thought we'd seen it all. Next story. I was observing an autopsy once for a forensic dentistry class back in the late 80s. The pathologist performing it was an older woman with gray hair tied neatly in a bun. She had this calm confidence about her, the kind that comes from decades of experience. Before she began, she told us she wouldn't be wearing gloves, explaining that she never had in her entire career. Keep in mind, this was during the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis, when that sort of thing made everyone nervous. The case we were observing was a homicide, a man who had been found on a front porch in New Orleans after being shot. Her assistant, James, wore a heavy leather apron and gloves, handling everything with care. As the examination continued, the pathologist worked with steady hands, searching for evidence that would explain exactly what had happened. At one point, I looked away for just a moment, and when I turned back, I noticed James in the corner, quietly smoking a cigarette. Still wearing his gloves from the procedure, the whole scene felt surreal, like something straight out of a dark, old film. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights, the smoke curling through the air, and the sense that we were watching something both scientific and unsettling all at once. It was one of those moments that sticks with you, not because it was gruesome, but because it felt like peeking behind the curtain of what life and death really look like in the hands of people who face them every day. Next story. I work in a funeral home, and one of the most unusual things I've ever encountered involves tissue donors. For anyone who doesn't know, when someone chooses to be a tissue donor, doctors can recover bone, skin, and other materials to help patients who need reconstructive surgery or life-saving treatment. It's an incredible act of generosity, but what happens afterward can look a little different than people might imagine. When donors are brought to us, their limbs sometimes feel lighter and more flexible because the bone structures have been carefully removed and replaced with supports, like plastic tubing or wooden dowels. It helps restore the body's shape before preparation, but it can still feel strange the first time you handle someone who has gone through that process. Working with tissue donors takes a lot of care and extra time. Embalming them properly requires skill and patience to make sure everything looks natural for the family's final goodbye. Even though it can be technically challenging, I've always found it deeply moving. Tissue donation gives others a second chance at life, burn victims, cancer patients, people recovering from major injuries. It's one of the most selfless gifts a person can give. So while the process might seem unusual to those of us who see it up close, it's also one of the most beautiful examples of compassion that exists in this line of work. Next story. My first job was at a cemetery. One day, we had a burial for someone who didn't have the means for a traditional service. They were given a simple wooden frame and a light casket made of cardboard. The night before, we had prepared the grave, but it rained heavily, nonstop, all night. By the time of the ceremony the next day, the ground was completely soaked, and the hole was filled with water. After the service ended, we began lowering the casket, but instead of settling, it started to float. We tried using equipment to gently guide it down, but the casket didn't hold together, and things didn't go as planned. In the end, we did what we had to do to finish the burial, though it didn't feel right. I remember speaking up, saying that this couldn't be the right way to handle it, but my supervisor told me this was how things were done. I still think about that day sometimes. It taught me that even in work that's routine, there are moments that stay with you, especially when you know someone deserved better. Next story. I used to work for a large funeral company in the UK, and during my time in Scotland, I spent a bit of time in one of their mortuaries. Every person who worked there had at least one story, something strange they couldn't quite explain. The most famous one was told to me by the manager himself. An elderly man had passed away and was brought in to be prepared for his funeral. His body was carefully preserved for several weeks, so that his family could hold a viewing when the arrangements were complete. Everything about the process was routine. Until one night, most of the staff had gone home, leaving only a small night crew since the place technically never closed. Sometime after midnight, the contracted security company got an alert. One of the internal alarms had gone off in an area that should have been completely empty. They checked the security footage, expecting to see maybe a cleaner or a staff member who'd forgotten something. But what they saw instead made everyone stop cold. On camera, they saw an elderly man, the same one who'd been brought in weeks earlier, calmly walking down one of the halls. He moved slowly, turned a corner, and then simply disappeared from view. When the night staff came in to check, they found the man still in his refrigerated unit, untouched and undisturbed. The footage was real. The alarm had gone off, and yet there was no logical explanation for what they saw. The manager told me it wasn't even the only time something like that had happened. Sometimes the alarms would go off late at night, as if someone was walking through the building. Security would rush over, and when they opened the doors, nothing. Empty rooms, quiet halls, no sign of movement at all. Creepy? Absolutely. But for the people who work there, it's just another night on the job. Next story. For a while, I dated a woman who was apprenticing as a funeral director and embalmer. She handled everything, from preparation to paperwork, even creating the photo slideshows and guest books for services. One night, she was working late and feeling stressed about a service she was preparing. The person she was working on had clearly said they didn't want any kind of memorial, but the family insisted on having one. She said her computer kept freezing, files were corrupting, and nothing seemed to go right. I decided to surprise her with a pizza, just to cheer her up. When I arrived, she was the only one in the entire building. We went upstairs to the office, ate, and talked for a while before I planned to head home. But when we came downstairs, every single light in the funeral home was on. Not just the hallways, every room, every corner, even storage closets. She swore she hadn't turned them on, and I definitely hadn't. We figured we'd better check the place, just in case someone had come in. The front door had been unlocked at one point, so it wasn't impossible. We started going room by room, turning off the lights as we went. It felt tense, like we were being watched. Finally, we reached the back of the building, where the crematoriums, prep rooms, and loading dock were. The person who hadn't wanted a service was in the prep room. I stood in the doorway while she went in to turn off the lights. The moment she hit the switch, a radio in the loading dock suddenly turned on, blasting at full volume. I froze for half a second, then ran to shut it off. No one was there, just an empty loading dock, and that old radio still humming faintly after I unplugged it. We turned off the remaining lights, and I left soon after. She stayed to finish her work, though I don't know how she managed after that. That night, she told me she was convinced it was the spirit of the person she'd been preparing, angry that a service was being held against their wishes. I'm not someone who really believes in ghosts, but I'll admit, I still can't explain what happened. The lights, the radio, the timing, all of it. Even now, thinking about it gives me chills. Next story. I'm not a medical worker, but I was there when my father passed away in the hospital. He was only 60. A bad fall caused a brain injury that doctors couldn't repair. For 6 days, we hoped for a miracle, but eventually, we had to accept that he wouldn't recover. He never wanted to stay on machines, so when the time came, we let him go peacefully. As his body began to shut down, the sounds of his breathing changed, and for a while, I couldn't get that sound out of my head. It reminded me of things I heard every day, and it stayed with me long after. Before I left the room, I kissed his forehead one last time. His face twitched slightly. Small, involuntary movements that the nurse explained were just his muscles reacting as his body relaxed. Even knowing that, it was hard to watch. 2 years later, I lost my dog, my best friend for 11 years. We had planned a quiet home goodbye, but the service was overbooked, so we had to go to a new vet at the last minute. I was an emotional mess. My dog was scared and hurting, and the whole situation felt rushed and unfair. The vet was incredibly kind, letting me take my time. When it was over, there was a small sound as they lifted him, just air leaving his lungs. For a second, I thought, or maybe hoped, he was still alive. The vet gently showed me that he wasn't. I still don't know which moment was harder, losing my dad or losing my dog. Both broke something inside me in a way that's hard to explain. But they also reminded me of how much love I had for them, and how lucky I was to have shared my life with them at all. Next story. Back in 2006, while I was deployed in Iraq, I saw a lot of things that have never left me. Most of the time, I could handle it. You learn to shut down certain emotions just to get through the day. But there was one man I'll never forget. He was a local civilian who'd been caught in crossfire. When we found him, he was sitting upright against a wall, almost like he'd just stopped to rest. There was a small meal still in his hand, wrapped in foil, like he'd been eating when everything happened. For a few minutes, I turned away to help one of my teammates with something. When I looked back, the light in the room had shifted. His eyes were open wide, and his expression had changed in a way that caught me completely off guard. For a second, I thought he'd moved. It wasn't frightening, just surreal, like the world had glitched. That image stuck with me. Out of all the people I saw during that year, he's the one whose face I remember the clearest. I could still describe him in perfect detail today. I don't know if anyone else remembers him, but I do. Sometimes it's the small, unexpected moments, not the chaos or the noise, that stay with you forever. Next story. For a couple of years, I worked in tissue collection for an eye bank. In that time, I probably handled a few hundred cases. Before that, I'd served as an infantryman in the Army from 2005 to 2012, so by that point, I'd already seen my share of loss. What surprised me wasn't the bodies themselves. After a while, they all start to feel the same. Just people at rest. It was the morgues that could be unsettling. Some were clean and modern, others old and dimly lit, with the kind of silence that seemed to press in on you. The ones that stay with me aren't the creepy ones, though. It's the stories that come through in small details, the things that remind you these were real lives, not just cases. A teenager who lost their life too soon. A young woman found after going missing in the mountains. A child taken by a rare illness. Those are the moments that make you pause. You start to build little fragments of who they might have been. Hobbies, families, dreams. And it reminds you that every person has a story worth remembering. I've worked with a lot of the dead, but what sticks with me most are the glimpses of the living, the sense of who these people once were. It's humbling, and it changes the way you see life itself. Next story. I once responded to a call for a possible house fire. We could smell smoke in the area, but at first, we couldn't find where it was coming from. After searching for a while, we finally located the source. A small home where the smell was strongest. When we went inside, we found an elderly woman on the floor near an old electric heater. At first, we thought she had just fallen, but when we tried to move her, it was clear something wasn't right. It turned out that the heater had been running for a long time and had caused more damage than anyone realized. The intense heat had affected both the floor and the area around her. By the time we arrived, everything had cooled down, leaving behind a scene none of us would ever forget. It took two of us to carefully move her, and the experience stuck with me for years. For a long time after that, even the smell of anything smoky would bring me right back to that day. Next story. I actually grew up in a nursing home. My family worked there, so from the time I was little, I was surrounded by people in their final years. I saw my first passing when I was 4. It sounds unusual, but for me, it became normal. Life and death were just part of the same world. Being around the residents taught me a lot. They shared stories, advice, and humor, and I grew up listening to people who had lived entire lifetimes. It was both heartbreaking and wise at the same time. By the time I was about 9, I was a big kid, so sometimes they'd ask me to help move things, or lend a hand when someone passed. It didn't really bother me, until one experience when I was about 13 or 14. There was an elderly woman, maybe in her 70s or 80s, who had been very sick for a long time. She refused food and water, and the nurses said it wouldn't be long, but somehow she kept holding on for more than 2 weeks. When I went upstairs to check on her, I remember being struck by how fragile she looked. Her face and body seemed so delicate, like even the slightest touch might break her. She looked peaceful, but otherworldly, almost like she didn't belong to this world anymore. I started quietly calling her the Bird Lady, not out of disrespect, but because something about her seemed light, almost like she was halfway between earth and sky. Even now, almost 10 years later, I still think of her sometimes. The quiet, the stillness, and the strange kind of grace she carried with her at the end. Next story. I once spent time in a medical examiner's office, and it completely changed the way I see life and death. It wasn't creepy so much as eye-opening. During one of the autopsies, the examiners were working on a middle-aged woman who had passed away unexpectedly. As they went through the process, the pathologist pointed out the cause of death, a small blood clot that had blocked her heart. He handed it to me to look at, and I was amazed. It was tiny, something that could fit inside a pen, yet it was powerful enough to stop everything. That moment really stuck with me. It made me realize how fragile the human body truly is. Later, I observed another case involving a young man who had been found outdoors after several days. The staff handled everything with calm professionalism, collecting samples and documenting details. The experience was intense. The sights, the smells, the sounds, and it showed me just how much work and care goes into finding the truth behind every unexplained death. Watching those professionals at work gave me a deep respect for what they do. It's not just science, it's service. Every case they handle helps give families answers, closure, and understanding. Next story. About 10 years ago, my mom passed away suddenly. When the paramedics were upstairs trying to save her, I stepped outside to get some air. I didn't realize at the time that I was having a panic attack. A police officer came out to check on me and said they had found a faint heartbeat. For a brief moment, I felt so much hope. I thought maybe she'd be okay. But what I didn't understand back then was that the paramedics had given her an adrenaline shot, and that's what caused that faint reading. That night was the hardest moment of my life. I was 16. I remember holding her hand for a long time, and how strange it felt that her usually warm hands were suddenly so cold. I miss her every day. After that, I actually thought about becoming a mortician. The people at the funeral home were so kind and compassionate, and they made such a painful process a little bit easier. Now I'm on my way to becoming a teacher, but part of me still thinks about going into that line of work one day to help other families through their hardest moments, the same way those people helped us. Next story. I used to work as a medical laboratory technician in the Army, and sometimes I would assist with autopsies at the hospital. One case that has stayed with me involved a young infantry soldier who had taken his own life. It was heartbreaking. The pathologist explained that the wound had caused internal damage, but hadn't been immediately fatal, meaning he likely passed away slowly. That realization really hit everyone in the room. What stood out to me most wasn't the medical side of it, but how human it all felt. Seeing someone so young, someone who probably had friends, plans, and a whole life ahead, reminded me of how fragile and unpredictable life can be. It was one of those days that made me stop and think about the people behind every uniform and how important it is to reach out and take care of each other. Next story. I don't work in medicine or anything related to it, but I've experienced loss up close. I lost my mom in 20, and then my closest sister in 2022, both unexpectedly. When my mom passed, my sister was the one who found her first. By the time I arrived, the emergency team had already done everything they could. I remember the room being quiet, that heavy, still kind of quiet that feels like time just stopped. My uncle and I helped move her so we could lay her on her bed for the priest to perform the final prayers. It was one of those moments that didn't feel real. Part of me was just running on instinct, doing what needed to be done, but the sadness didn't truly hit until later, when I realized I was saying goodbye to my mom in a way I'd never imagined. Then, 2 years later, I lost my sister in the same house. I went over one morning and couldn't get inside her room. She wasn't answering me, and when I finally got the door open, I realized she had passed peacefully in her sleep hours earlier. That moment, the silence, the realization, is something I'll never forget. It's not the kind of memory that fades. It just becomes something you carry quietly. Losing them both changed me. It reminded me how fragile everything is, and how important it is to love people out loud while you can. Next story. I was part of a search and rescue team for about 3 years. My role was on the scuba diving team, the part of the crew responsible for recovering people who had gone missing at sea. It was challenging work, both physically and emotionally. The ocean changes everything. Saltwater, currents, and sea life all make recovery incredibly difficult. The case that still stays with me involved a missing woman whose situation was heartbreaking. She had been brought into the country through human trafficking and was being forced into a life she didn't choose. In desperation, she had taken her own life and gone into the sea near a rocky coastline. When we were called to search for her, conditions were terrible. Low visibility, strong waves, and jagged rocks. My dive partner and I were scanning near an outcrop when, through the dark water, I saw a pale hand drift out from a small opening between the rocks. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but as we moved closer, I realized what it was, and we began the slow, careful process of bringing her back to the surface. Even with the years of experience, that recovery stayed with me. The ocean had taken its toll, and the sight was something that would be hard for anyone to forget. What made it even harder was the thought of what her life had been like before that moment. How much pain she must have felt to choose the sea as her escape. To this day, I still think about her. It was one of those missions that reminded me just how fragile and unfair life can be, and how important compassion is, even in the toughest parts of the job. Next story. I work as a motor vehicle collision analyst. My job is to investigate serious car accidents, figure out what caused them, and explain my findings in court when needed. Over the years, I've seen many tragic scenes involving both people and animals. You get used to the work in a professional way, but some cases stay with you. There's one I always think about every fall. It happened one late October. I was called to the scene of a single vehicle accident. The driver had been going too fast through a curvy section of road. She lost control, the car rolled over, and she was thrown from the vehicle because she wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Sadly, she didn't survive. Part of my job is to examine the scene carefully and look for clues that explain exactly what happened. I remember standing there, doing my work, focused and calm. Just another day on the job. Later that afternoon, my wife called to ask how my day was going. I told her I was still working and couldn't talk long. She then asked if I'd be home in time because that night we were planning to carve pumpkins with our kids. That moment hit me harder than the entire investigation. Something about the timing, the pumpkins, the season, everything, connected in a way that stayed in my head. Even years later, I still can't bring myself to carve pumpkins with my kids, and they've never really known why. Next story. I used to have a night job transporting people who had recently passed away. Picture this: black suit, white shirt, black tie, an unmarked black van. And my boss insisted we wear white gloves so we'd look professional and respectful. One night, I had to drive a woman who had passed from illness about 250 miles. taking her from a hospital to a funeral home near her family. It was a long, quiet drive, just the sound of the road for hours. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a low moaning sound from behind me. It went something like, long and slow. I nearly jumped out of my skin, swerved a little, and kicked up gravel off the shoulder of the freeway before realizing what had happened. Logically, I knew it wasn't anything supernatural. It was just air escaping from the body. But in that moment, at 2 in the morning, it definitely didn't feel that way. Next story. I'm a human osteologist, which means I study human bones. Most of the time, my work isn't scary at all. They're just bones, clean, dry, and silent. But there was one moment that really gave me chills. I was working with a skull from the collection one day when I picked up the lower jaw and heard something faint rattling inside. When I looked closer, I realized it was the wisdom teeth, still forming, not yet fully grown in. That detail hit me hard. Wisdom teeth usually come in around 18 to 20 years old, and at that time, I was about the same age, just starting to feel mine come through. That realization stopped me for a moment. This person had once been my age. She had her whole life ahead of her, maybe even dreams and plans just like mine. It was the first time my work felt deeply personal. It reminded me that behind every skeleton I study, there was once a real person with a story. Next story. When I was a teenager, I had a part-time job at a morgue in San Antonio. I was paid under the table to clean up, do laundry, and keep things tidy. Not the most glamorous job, but it paid. Now, San Antonio sits on the edge of Tornado Alley, so big storms aren't exactly rare. One afternoon, a huge thunderstorm rolled through while I was working. Everyone else had stepped out, and I was sitting alone in the break room, watching VH1 and trying to ignore the thunder outside. The morgue didn't have any windows. It was an old warehouse downtown, built for privacy. So when the power suddenly went out, it was pitch black. The only light came from a single red exit sign glowing through the open doorway into the main room. I let out a quiet eep, stood up slowly, and called out for anyone. But, of course, no one answered. When I peeked into the main prep room, it was lit entirely by that red glow, all shadows and shapes I couldn't quite make out. I didn't need to see any more. I bolted out through the front into the rain and stood under the covered garage just waiting for someone, anyone, to come back. Standing there, soaked and alone, I remember thinking, this is it. I'm in a real-life Resident Evil scene. Still one of the scariest and most unforgettable moments of my life. Next story. I used to do restorative makeup work for the funeral home, and one case will stay with me for the rest of my life. It was for a little girl, just 9 years old, who was an identical twin. After I finished my work, I went to the office to put my tools away. And there, standing by the doorway, was a girl who looked exactly like her. It was her sister. The family had dressed her in the same outfit her twin would be buried in. Seeing them side by side like that was indescribably sad. When I looked back at the photo I'd used as a reference, I realized I'd actually been using her sister's picture the whole time. Their faces were mirror images of one another, down to the small marks that made them unique. The mother told me she hadn't been able to separate their photos. They'd always done everything together, even dressed alike. A year later, I got another call, this time for the sister. She had passed away too, and her family wanted her laid to rest wearing the same dress as before. That one broke me more than anything else I've done in this line of work. Not because it was tragic, but because it showed just how deep a bond can go between two people. Even in loss, they were together. Next story. I once asked a friend of mine who works as an undertaker if he had any strange or memorable stories from his job. I expected him to talk about something like a sound or movement from a body. You know, one of those eerie but explainable things that happen in his line of work. But instead, he told me something completely different. And honestly, even creepier. He said the strangest part of his job wasn't the deceased, it was the living. Apparently, there were a few people in the area who would show up uninvited and try to get inside the morgue area. Some would hang around outside, peeking through the windows, or asking oddly specific questions about the building's security and access. One guy even made a very uncomfortable joke about looking at certain people who had passed away, clearly thinking it was funny, but it just showed how inappropriate he was being. My friend said those were the moments that really unsettled him. Not the job itself, not the silence of the morgue, but the strange behavior of some of the people still walking around outside. Sometimes the living are way creepier than the dead. Next story. The morgue at our small county jail was attached right to the main building, so whenever someone passed away, a local mortician would come by to take the body to the funeral home. This mortician was something else. A tall man, about 6'7", thin as a rail, originally from Ghana. He spoke with a deep, calm accent and always dressed like someone straight out of another century. Full suit, top hat, gold pocket watch, polished shoes, the whole thing. He usually showed up in the middle of the night, around 2 a.m, when I was on the night shift, completely alone. Every time, I'd have to help him move the body from one stretcher to another and into his van. There was nothing supernatural about it, but man, it felt surreal. The quiet of the jail, the echo of our footsteps, and this tall, elegant man who looked like he'd stepped out of an old New Orleans ghost story, all while we carefully moved someone who had passed on. It wasn't scary, just strange, like being stuck between two worlds, one living and one long gone. Next story. Years ago, I worked as a pathology lab assistant at a large hospital known for its labor and delivery department. Part of my job included taking specimens down to the morgue freezer, not the kind of task anyone really gets used to. Sometimes the samples came from heartbreaking situations, pregnancies that didn't make it. Because of that, one of the freezer shelves was reserved for those cases. It was always a somber place, quiet and cold. One afternoon, I went down as usual to store a sample. When I opened the heavy freezer door, I suddenly heard a faint sound, a baby crying. It was muffled, distant, but definitely there. For a few seconds, my brain couldn't make sense of it. There was no way, right? Then I realized the sound wasn't coming from inside the freezer at all. It was coming from the next room over, probably a parent visiting that part of the hospital with their newborn. That realization was such a rush of relief. But for those few seconds, when I couldn't explain what I was hearing, it was one of the eeriest moments of my entire career. Next story. The creepiest moment I ever had happened while I was working alone in the morgue around 4 a.m. I was using the lift to place a body into one of the storage chambers. It had just reached about eye level when, suddenly, the power went out. Everything went completely dark. I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face. The air fan stopped, and the silence that followed was unreal. Then I started to hear faint sounds, the quiet rustling of plastic, like movement in the stillness. And then, voices, soft, distant, and completely unclear, just whispering somewhere in the darkness. My heart was pounding, and I was standing perfectly still, trying to figure out if I was really hearing what I thought I was. A few moments later, the lights flickered back on, the fan started up again, and everything was normal. That's when I realized what the voices were. The automated message system playing on loop. The power has gone out. Switching to generator power. Scared half to death by a safety announcement. Definitely my creepiest and funniest moment on the job. Next story. This might not be the spooky story you were expecting, but I worked as a gravedigger and cemetery groundskeeper all through college. Honestly, it wasn't creepy at all. The strangest thing I ever came across was an unexpected dip in the ground over an older section of graves. When a burial doesn't use a cement vault, the casket can eventually collapse as the years go by, and that leaves a small pothole on the surface. It's a pain to fix and definitely odd to think about what's happening several feet underground, but it's just part of how time works on the earth. That's why, at the cemetery where I worked, all new burials required a cement vault to keep the ground even and protect the site. Most of the sunken spots happened over much older graves from decades ago. To be honest, I've never believed cemeteries or morgues are scary places. Death is simply a part of life. The cemetery I worked in was actually one of the most peaceful places I've ever been. We took pride in keeping the grounds beautiful and calm, so families visiting their loved ones could feel a sense of peace when they came. Next story. I once responded to one of the hardest calls of my career, an electrical accident involving two young kids. There had been a fault in the power system that sent electricity through one of the stabilizing cables on a utility pole. A child touched the cable and got trapped by the current, and his friend tried to help him. By the time our team arrived, both children had already passed away, but the cable was still live. We couldn't get close until the power company arrived and shut everything down. So, we stood there, unable to do anything but wait. It was heartbreaking. One of those moments that never really leaves you. Even years later, I still think about that day, whenever I drive past power lines or see kids playing nearby. It reminded me how fragile life can be, and how fast everything can change in a single moment. Next story. The creepiest scene I ever walked into was an apartment where a woman had passed away and hadn't been found for several weeks during the heat of late summer. When we entered, the first thing I noticed was the sound, a constant buzzing in the air. At first, I thought the lights were dim or broken, but when I looked closer, I realized the bulbs weren't dark. They were completely covered by insects. Every single light in the apartment, the ceiling lamps, floor lamps, even the kitchen lights, was swarming with them. The windows, too, were covered so thick that almost no sunlight came through. The air felt heavy, the smell was overwhelming, and the sound of wings was nonstop. It honestly felt like walking into a scene from a horror movie. The woman had passed away on the couch, and time and heat had taken their toll. We did our best to handle everything respectfully and carefully, but the sight of all those flies was the part that really stuck with me. I can handle most things in this job, but that day, the sheer number of them made my skin crawl. When it was over, I remember just standing outside, taking a deep breath of fresh air, and realizing I'd probably never forget that day. Next story. Back when I worked for a funeral home, I was often on call overnight to bring someone into our care after they'd passed. Most nights were quiet, but every once in a while, something would give you chills. One night, I got a call around 1 a.m. to pick up an elderly gentleman who had passed peacefully. By the time I returned to the funeral home and settled him into our cooler, it was close to 3 a.m. Everything was done, the paperwork finished, lights dimmed. I was just about to set the alarm and head home when, out of nowhere, the prep room door behind me flung open and then slammed shut just as hard. That door was solid wood and heavy. It never moved on its own, not even in a draft. Right before it happened, I remember the hair on the back of my neck standing straight up. I didn't sleep much that night. Let's just say I showed up early for my shift the next morning. Next story. There's a lot of strange stuff that happens when you work around hospitals and morgues. During the height of COVID, our local hospital had to use extra space for storage, so they ended up keeping all the test samples in the morgue cooler, right next to the actual patients being held there. Half the staff started coming down with sinus infections, and no one could figure out why. But honestly, the creepiest thing I've ever experienced didn't involve the dead. It involved the living. At our hospital, the morgue is set up with a large autopsy room, a small hallway, and then a cooler in the back. I had to drop someone off for an autopsy one night, and since I was there so often, I had my own key, so I didn't have to bother security every time. I went in like usual. The lights were off, completely silent, and I assumed I was alone. I filled out the paperwork, then walked over to open the cooler door to grab a table. The last thing I expected was movement. I opened the door, and right there in the cooler were a security guard and a housekeeper, together. I froze, they froze, and then I just slowly shut the door and quietly walked out like nothing happened. 3 days later, I went back for another pickup. Both of them had resigned. Next story. A few years ago, I was traveling through Croatia and ended up in a small bar where I met two retired men. One had been a surgeon, the other a firefighter. After a few drinks, they started trading stories from their careers, and one story from the firefighter really stuck with me. He said that years ago, somewhere in the former Yugoslavia, his team responded to a house fire. When they arrived, the flames weren't too bad, but they couldn't find the homeowner anywhere. After searching the property, they discovered him in the basement. He had taken his own life before. The fire started. The fire hadn't burned through the basement, but the intense heat had still caused major damage. When the crew prepared to remove the body, it was fragile and difficult to handle. They carefully placed it in a heavy-duty bag before moving him. The firefighter said the part he'd never forget was how strange it felt to carry. The heat had changed everything about it. Even after decades of service, that call stayed with him. He told the story not to shock anyone, but as a reminder of the things first responders see and how those moments never fully leave you. Next story. I used to work in law enforcement, and while I wasn't usually assigned to cases involving the dead, one early morning call definitely stands out. It was around 5 a.m. when we got a report of a break-in at a mausoleum in a local cemetery. The deputies who arrived first hadn't gone inside yet. It was pitch dark, quiet, and honestly, a little unnerving. There was no danger to anyone, so we took our time before heading in. When we entered, we saw that someone had forced their way through the front doors. Deeper inside, one of the family vaults, a marble crypt about 15 feet above the floor, had been pried open and pulled down. Inside, everything was gone. According to the records, it had contained the cremated remains of 3 people, and the mausoleum hadn't been opened in about 15 years. We checked the cemetery cameras, but there was nothing. No vehicles, no lights, no movement. It was as if whoever did it had vanished into thin air. We managed to contact the family's only surviving relative, who lived out of state. At first, they were polite and cooperative, until I explained what the call was about. Then, mid-conversation, they switched to saying, "I don't speak English," and hung up. We never reached them again. To this day, we never solved it. No suspects, no clues, and no clear motive. Maybe it was theft, maybe something stranger, but that quiet, empty mausoleum still crosses my mind sometimes. Next story. My fiancée passed away just 6 days before our wedding. That morning I went to wake her up, but she wasn't responding. I tried to stay calm and check for a pulse, then began CPR, hoping I could somehow bring her back. For a brief moment, I thought I felt something, maybe her pulse, maybe my own, and I truly believed she might be okay. But when nothing changed, that tiny bit of hope disappeared, and the reality hit me harder than I can describe. I had only practiced CPR in training before, never on a real person, and I wasn't prepared for how it would actually feel. That day is something I'll never forget. It's been 3 months now, and I still don't have any answers about how she passed away. Every time I hear myself wheeze, a lingering symptom from my post-COVID asthma, I get pulled right back into that moment. It's a memory I live with every day, but I keep going because of our little one, our 2-year-old, who reminds me of her in so many ways. Next story. Before the pandemic, I worked at a funeral home that honestly wasn't managed very well. I was a funeral assistant, and one of the embalmers, let's call her AJ, was known for being difficult to work with. A few days before this story, AJ picked up someone who had passed away from a serious infection. The person was scheduled for cremation, but instead of storing them properly, AJ decided to leave the body on a stretcher for 4 days, saying it wouldn't matter since the cremation was coming soon. When it came time to move the body to the crematory, AJ and I went to the prep room together. The smell in the air was overwhelming, something you could almost feel around you. We put on protective gear and got ready to move the stretcher. Unfortunately, one of the wheels was old and jammed, so it had to be unlocked by hand instead of using the pedal. AJ told me to unlock it, so I bent down carefully to do it. But then, for some reason, she thought it would be funny to shake the stretcher as a prank. The sudden movement caused some fluid to spill over the edge, and a bit landed on me. I froze for a second, then quietly walked to the staff restroom to clean up. The owners saw me and, realizing what had happened, told me to go home for the rest of the day, with pay. Let's just say I learned 2 things that day. Always double check your gear, and never turn your back on AJ. Next story. I worked at a funeral home for quite a while, and this story happened about a month after I started. It was a holiday weekend, so only a few of us were working, just the transport team and me. They came by to drop someone off and then headed back out. A few minutes later, I thought they were still around, and I needed to ask them something. So I walked into the prep room and nearly jumped out of my skin. Right there, on the stretcher, was a man sitting straight up, looking right at me as I opened the door. I froze, let out a sound I'm not proud of, and I'm not going to lie. It scared me so badly, I almost lost it. After a few seconds, I realized what had happened. The transport guys had picked him up from a hospital where he'd passed while sitting in a reclined position, and his body had stiffened that way. They couldn't lay him flat, so they just brought him in as he was. Looking back, it's pretty funny, but in that moment, it was hands down the biggest scare of my career. Next story. I once got accidentally punched by someone who had already passed away. I used to work hospital security, and one of our duties was to help move bodies to and from the morgue. One day, we were transferring someone, and because of how stiff the body was, the arms were sticking out at awkward angles. I tried to gently adjust the arm to make it easier to fit the stretcher into the storage unit. For a second, the arm stayed right where I placed it, and then suddenly snap. It swung back down and hit me straight in the groin. I froze, half laughing and half in pain, while my coworker tried not to lose it. That moment became one of those you wouldn't believe it unless you were there stories we joked about for weeks. Next story. I once had a patient whose heart stopped unexpectedly. I immediately began CPR, just like I'd done many times before. About halfway through my first round of compressions, something happened I'll never forget. The patient's color started coming back, her eyes opened, and she even turned her head and made a faint sound. I stopped compressions for a second, but as soon as I did, she went unresponsive again. That's when I realized what was happening. Her heart wasn't working on its own, but my compressions were strong enough to keep blood flowing to her brain. Every time I pressed, she would wake up. When I stopped, she would fade again. I had to keep going, even delivering a shock while she was somewhat conscious. It was one of the hardest moments of my career. I've handled many emergencies before, but this one stayed with me for a long time. It was both incredible and deeply unsettling to witness. Next story. When I was a student nurse working in the ICU, we had a young patient, just 19 years old, who was battling leukemia. Her condition had become severe, and her body had lost the ability to form blood clots. Every time we gave her treatment, started an IV, or drew labs, she would start bleeding again. We were doing everything possible to keep her alive. The whole team was moving quickly, giving transfusions, starting new lines, following every order from the code leader. It felt like organized chaos. Every one of us focused completely on giving her a chance. Despite all our efforts, she didn't make it. The room looked like something out of a disaster scene. Equipment everywhere, staff exhausted, the air heavy with silence. I'll never forget stepping out of that room to grab supplies and seeing her husband sitting in the hallway. He couldn't have been much older than her. He was just sitting there, quietly waiting for news, not knowing what was happening inside. That moment stayed with me more than anything else. It wasn't the chaos or the urgency that haunted me. It was the stillness afterward, the heartbreaking quiet that comes when you realize there's nothing more you can do. Next story. I'm an ER nurse. One time, a patient passed away and no family came to claim them, so they were taken to the hospital morgue. Their phone, though, was accidentally left behind in the ER. Every day at 2:30 p.m., the phone's alarm would go off. We couldn't turn it off or power it down without the passcode, and somehow the battery just kept going. We locked it in the medication room, but it was still loud enough to hear. So, for a week, the same ringtone went off at the same time, echoing through the unit. Ever since then, whenever I hear that ringtone, I get chills. Next story. I used to work as an EMT, and one day, we got a call for a person who wasn't breathing and didn't have a pulse. A police officer got there just before us, and my partner and I arrived right after. We found the man in his bathroom, which, honestly, is where a lot of these calls end up. He just recently passed, so we started setting up to try resuscitation. The room was tight, but we managed to get a backboard on the floor. I took the head and airway, my partner took the chest and shoulders, and the officer grabbed the legs. We lifted him up, and suddenly, the officer ends up holding just one foot because it was a prosthetic. My partner and I just froze for a second, but the poor officer looked completely horrified, dropped the foot, and ran out of the room. For us, it wasn't creepy, just another day on the job. But for that officer, it was clearly his "nope, I'm done" moment of the week. Next story. My ex-boyfriend, who used to be a police officer, once told me about the hardest case he ever responded to. Officers had been called to an abandoned building after neighbors reported a strange smell. When they went inside, they discovered a heartbreaking scene. Several young children who had been left there alone for a long time during the middle of winter. Two of the children hadn't survived, and one little girl was still alive when they found her. She'd been trying to take care of herself the only way she knew how, after being trapped there for weeks. Investigators later learned that their mother had been struggling deeply with addiction and had disappeared months earlier, leaving them without anyone to care for them. She, too, had lost her life before ever returning. When my ex told me the story, he actually started to cry. He said that of all the things he'd seen in his career, that was the one that broke him. The sight of those children and the thought of how alone they were stayed with him for years. It reminded him and me that behind every tragic story in the news are real people, families, children, and lives that deserve so much better. Next story. People often think the job is about the dead, but honestly, it's the living who leave the deepest impression. It's not the morgues or the removals that stay with you. It's the homes you walk into, the sudden stillness, the chaos frozen in time, the small details that tell you how someone really lived. There was the car filled with a dozen tiny dogs left behind after their owner passed, or the home where every surface was covered in dust and neglect, showing how long the person had been struggling. Sometimes a hospice nurse would be sitting quietly in the living room, waiting for us, while family members tried to process what had just happened. I'll never forget one call involving an elderly man who had passed away alone. The scene was heartbreaking. It was clear he had been ill for some time. Even the police officer who responded had to step outside for air. As we carried him to the van, a woman suddenly pulled up in a red car and nearly lost control when she saw what was happening. She jumped out, crying uncontrollably, wanting to say goodbye one last time. The emotion in that moment hit all of us. So raw, so human. That's what people don't see about this line of work. It's not just about loss, it's about everything that leads up to it. The loneliness, the love, and the reminders of how fragile life can be. Next story. I used to work as a nurse in a long-term care facility, and there's one patient I'll never forget. She was an older woman with a severe illness that had taken away much of her strength and her ability to eat or drink safely. Because of her condition, we couldn't give her water or even ice chips. The only thing we could do was gently moisten her mouth with little sponges. It was never enough to really help. I remember how she would beg for water, her voice rough and tired. The last time I gave her medicine, she looked at me with this exhausted expression and said, "That wasn't very much water." An hour later, when I went to check on her, she had quietly passed away. She didn't have any family there with her at the end. The other staff told me she hadn't been the easiest person to get along with in life, and that even her children had stayed away. But in that last moment, she was just a human being, scared, tired, and thirsty. Her voice and the look she gave me have stayed with me ever since. It was a powerful reminder that no matter what kind of life someone has lived, nobody deserves to be alone when they leave this world. Next story. I've been a paramedic for a while, and in this line of work, you see some things that never really leave you. A few moments stand out. One time, my crew and I had just finished a call where a woman had passed away. We'd confirmed it, done our paperwork, and were quietly packing up when, out of nowhere, her eyes opened. It was just a reflex, a muscle spasm that can happen after death. But I'll admit I checked her pulse again just to be sure. You can't help it in those moments. Another case I'll never forget was something called CPR-induced consciousness. It's incredibly rare, but it happens when the heart isn't actually beating, yet chest compressions move enough blood to the brain that the person becomes partly aware. I've seen it twice. They'll reach up or look around while you're doing compressions, then fade again when you stop. It's surreal. One of my coworkers even had to lightly sedate a patient like that, so they could keep doing CPR safely on the way to the hospital. Not every strange call happens during a rescue, though. We once got sent on a wellness check that turned out to be someone who'd passed away several days earlier. The officer with me was new, and it was one of those quiet, heavy moments that teaches you what this job can really feel like. And then there was the Halloween night call. Dispatch told us there was a medical alarm going off at a graveyard. We figured someone was joking. Turns out the small office on site had a security system that got mixed up in the system and was coded as a medical alert. So there we were, Halloween night, lights flashing in a cemetery. just to reset a false alarm. This job has its share of chaos, heartbreak, and a few truly bizarre moments. You never know what you're walking into, but that's what keeps it unforgettable. Next story. I once responded to a mass casualty event and was assigned to help manage the casualty collection point. My role was to receive the fallen as they arrived by helicopter, transfer them to trucks, and bring them to the designated area for processing. There are a few things from that day that will stay with me forever. First, the physical realities of death are something you can never fully prepare for. When someone passes, their body stiffens over time, and that makes it difficult to move or reposition them. It's something simple, but it leaves an impression. Second, handling someone who's passed with their eyes still open. There's something deeply human about that. I remember closing one person's eyes myself, and it struck me that I was probably the last person who would ever look into them. That's not something I take lightly. And finally, the biggest lesson of all, people can do terrible things to each other, especially in war. But even an enemy combatant deserves respect in death. Dignity doesn't stop at the battlefield. That experience changed the way I see both life and service. It taught me that compassion doesn't end when the mission does. Next story. My dad passed away on the 4th of July at exactly 9 p.m. Just as the fireworks outside reached their peak. We'd spent the entire day together as a family. Friends coming by, music playing, stories shared, laughter filling the house. Even though we all knew it was time, there was so much love in the air. When that final moment came, it was just us. My mom, my brother, my sister, and me, each with a hand on him, thanking him, telling him it was okay to rest. The fireworks outside felt almost like a celebration meant just for him. Afterward, we stayed with him for a long time, telling more stories, laughing and crying all at once. When we finally looked at him, he looked peaceful, even younger somehow, with the faintest smile on his face. Later, my godmother, who's a nurse and has helped many families through that moment, told us she'd never seen anyone pass away smiling. That was my dad, full of humor, grace, and love, right up to the very end. He really did set the bar high for how to live and how to leave, with peace and dignity. Next story. I don't work in a morgue, but I once had an experience that stayed with me ever since. One of my employees had been on home hospice, and his wife, who I also knew personally, called me one evening because she thought his oxygen monitor wasn't working properly. I went over to check on them. When I arrived, I quickly realized the monitor wasn't malfunctioning. He had just passed, his breathing had stopped, and there was no heartbeat. He still felt warm, so it had only just happened. I had to be the one to tell his wife. She was heartbroken, understandably, and I stepped back to give her space. After a while, she asked for help dressing him in his best suit so close friends and coworkers could come pay their respects. It was part of her cultural tradition, and I wanted to honor that. As we moved him, there were faint, unexpected sounds, just air leaving his lungs. But in the moment, it felt otherworldly. Eventually, a few people arrived to say goodbye before the cremation service came later that evening. It's been 2 years, and I still think about that night sometimes. It was surreal, peaceful, and heavy all at once, and it reminded me how fragile and deeply human those final moments can be. Next story. I've been a registered nurse for 25 years, and I've seen a lot in that time, more than I can count. But there's one patient I'll never forget. She was in her 50s, battling cancer, when she suddenly went into cardiac arrest. The doctor made the call to try and place stents to save her, but despite everything we did, she passed away on the table. I'm not a religious person at all, never have been. But in that moment, something happened I still can't explain. While performing compressions, I felt a shift, like something just changed in the air around us. I looked up, and one of my coworkers had this stunned look on his face. He quietly said, "Did you see that?" I nodded, because I had. We couldn't even put it into words. The doctor asked, "What else can we do?" And we both knew it was time to stop. It's been years, but I still think about that day. I've seen science at work my whole career, but whatever happened in that moment was beyond anything I've ever understood. Next story. I wasn't a morgue worker, but I was part of the hospital cleaning staff for about 6.5 years. Every so often, my schedule would include the hospital morgue. The first time I ever went in there, the team was preparing an elderly gentleman who had recently passed. I was just quietly doing my job when, out of nowhere, he sat up. I'm not proud to admit it, but I absolutely screamed. The person training me and the two women working with the patient started laughing and said, "First time, huh?" They explained that sometimes air gets trapped in the abdomen, and when the body is moved, it can make it look like they suddenly sit up or even make a small sound. Completely normal, they said. Still, from that day on, if I knew someone was being taken care of in there, I'd politely ask how long they'd be and come back later. Funny enough, the morgue actually became one of my favorite areas to clean during the summer. Always nice and cool, kept around 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Weirdly peaceful too.